How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Conscious Bodybuilding Podcast. Today, my guest is Menno Henselmans. Menno recently wrote a book, The Science of Self-Control, and I wanted to discuss that book with Menno today, just mostly because it has had a profound impact on my daily life. And I think it's an amazing book, and I think more people should be aware of Menno. So, Menno, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, and thank you for the compliment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you wrote a great book. Before we get into the book, as I mentioned, I think more people should be familiar with who you are. Could you briefly talk about yourself and how you got to the point at which you decided to write this book?
Sure. So most people know me for my PT course, my public speaking, and general fitness information. So I do scientific research. I coach people one-on-one, online coaching, starting off with mostly bodybuilders, powerlifters, but these days also doing a lot of gen pop, people that just want to look good naked or just want a decent physique. And that sort of took off and things were very successful over the past decade. I've started publishing scientific research and now educate other people on how to become personal trainers with my own certification program. But there were a lot of things that I'm also very interested in, especially since I originally studied behavioral economics, which is in large part behavioral psychology. And diet adherence as a coach, any coach will tell you diet adherence is one of the most important things of coaching. So there was definitely an intersection there, and my general interest in psychology, as well as just self-improvement and productivity. But a lot of these concepts don't lend themselves very well to a Facebook post or an Instagram post. You know, if you've read the book, so you'll find that the first chapters are all general psychology information and explaining how willpower works, and also debunking a lot of common but false ideas about how willpower works. And only when you understand all of those things and you have that foundation, can you really go into the rest of the concrete tips in the rest of the book. So I really saved all that up essentially and just put it into one book that's essentially like 4 books together, because one chapter is almost one book, and one chapter is on diet adherence, one chapter is on productivity, one chapter is on general motivation, and one smaller chapter is on how to make working out less effortful. So that's basically how it all came to be.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think coaching others myself, I wanted to mention this. I think that generally speaking, when you coach competitive athletes or people who are a little bit more involved in this, I guess the assumption sometimes is that this self-control and this productivity, all this doesn't affect them because they are generally more adherent. Mm-hmm. And maybe sometimes you have to work a little bit more on those self-control habits and such with someone who isn't as experienced. But I think that is a common misconception, because for myself and other people that I've been able to help, when I start to focus on a lot of these things in the book and a lot of these habits, it just makes adherence easier and more sustainable. I think I don't know, bodybuilders, especially like you talk post-show and unsustainable dieting practices, a lot of the time they do have binge behaviors and have unhealthy relationship with food, etc. And I think it's really important not only for the general population to understand these, but someone who is a competitive athlete, just because there's no you don't get bonus points for making things harder, really. And I found it very applicable in a lot of ways for my bodybuilding, as well as people who are just trying to get in shape. So I wanted to get into some topics in the book. I think people could make the misconception of classifying this as maybe a self-help or motivational book or something like that. Where does this book separate itself from maybe something self-help or motivational category?
Yeah, I mean, technically, I think it is a self-help book. And in Amazon, you have limited categories, right? Especially when it comes to fitness and the more niche things. So I think in Amazon, it's in both self-help and applied psychology. Okay. And applied psychology is pretty vague. Most people probably think of like psychiatrists, they read applied psychology books to learn to perfect their trade. And self-help books are more the complete opposite end, where most people have, or at least actually a lot of people on my Amazon reviews actually say, like, I hate self-help books. I loathe self-help books. And I completely understand that sentiment. I have the same thing. Most self-help books, I think, are really vague. The opposite of my data-driven, evidence-based, very science-heavy approach.
Right.
And just a lot of whizzy-woozy stuff that really, when you read it all, you're like, yeah, okay, makes sense. That makes sense. And some things are like, okay, way out there, very spiritual. But then when you read the whole book in the end, you're like, okay, so what really changes now? Like, what am I supposed to do in my life? You need a ground vision. And it's like, okay, so concretely, what do I do? And
Right.
you're really no further than you were before.
Yeah, I mean, I've read many self-help books, a lot of the more popular ones too. And sometimes I can take stuff away from it, and it definitely influences the way I think sometimes. But for example, like this book, there were things that I read that I implemented that day, just due to the practicality of some of those things. I think as far as how digestible the book is, I was able to actually make noticeable differences just by implementing a lot of it. And I think it probably is in part because it's very data driven, right? And it's not vague, as you mentioned. So yeah, I would agree. I don't know if it fits perfectly into self-help, or if we were going to maybe recategorize self-help and have it trend in this direction. I think that would be really cool. But so there's an elephant on the cover of the book. When I went to read this, I had no idea why that was. It was just like, interesting. But as I read the book, I started to understand that it is an analogy that you refer back to a couple times. So what is with the elephant? Why did you choose to put it on the cover of the book?
Good question. I've actually never had that question before from anyone.
Oh, really?
Interestingly, yeah. Even though I think it's not readily obvious. Yeah. The elephant comes from the metaphor, which I borrowed from Jonathan Haidt, which I highly recommend, brilliant psychologist. And he uses the metaphor of a rider and an elephant to explain how the brain works. And those systems, in my view, are very, very similar to what Daniel Kahneman uses or describes as System 1 and System 2. And Paul MacLean has talked about three systems, like the reptile brain, the paleo-mammalian brain, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the more rational brain. I think all of those systems, sometimes some people also talk about the intuitive and the rational brain. All of those things, I think, refer kind of to the same concepts, which also makes sense in terms of the organization of the brain. The lower parts, literally the lower parts of the brain, but also metaphorically, intellectually speaking, they are the System 1, the intuitive system. They're like the elephant. They are also what we have in common with most animals. They are very associative. They function fast. They operate based on emotions, intuitions, heuristics. So it's like if you would take away the top part of our brain, we would essentially be very much like many other animals. But what we humans have, on top of this, literally on top of it in our brain, we have the prefrontal cortex, or also called the neocortex. And this is evolved literally on top of it, and as a sort of an add-on on this other brain. And this part is the rational brain. This part is what separates us in large part from most animals. It allows us to do math, learn new languages, and learn language in the first place. It allows us to make complicated logical choices and to reason rationally. And in large part, the neocortex, the rational part of our brain, System 2, however you call it, the rational rider that's sitting on top of the emotional elephant, this part is a small part of all of what goes on in our brain. And it's mostly there to control System 1, because System 1 is far more powerful. It does most of the things. There are estimates from psychology generally include that over 90%, sometimes 95%, I've even seen 99% as figures, saying that those things that occur in our brain are not conscious. So our brain is doing a lot of things, like making sense of all the auditory and sensory input. And in the end, what comes into our consciousness and what we can rationally think about is a tiny fraction of that. And it's only the end result of all of these other processes that already occurred before that. And with that, we can essentially modulate system one. So essentially, the metaphor of a rider sitting on top of an elephant is really apt in that the elephant's really doing most of the work, but the rider is trying to steer the elephant in some directions. And it's also apt in the sense that the elephant ultimately essentially has control in that it's much more powerful. So if you're smart, the rider can keep control of the elephant. But when it really comes down to it, when you're in a state of what's called ego depletion, for example, or the fuck it effect, you don't have a leg to stand on. No pun intended. So that's basically the idea of the metaphor. And on the cover, you also see that the brain, even though it's much smaller, it weighs more. That's the metaphor on the cover than the elephant, which is an analogy that basically I'm telling you how to rationally, or how you can make your brain more powerful than your emotions.
Oh, got it. Oh, that's really cool. I didn't realize that. Yeah. So I think the concept's really cool, and it made it very, when you referred back to that analogy, it was very like, I understood it a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's pretty fair to say in like psychology, willpower is becoming a little bit more understood, at least from some of the resources and books that I've read. Generally speaking, like on a general population level, I think there's still a lot of misconceptions about it. I guess a good question to ask would be, is willpower a limited resource?
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest conceptions, that the analogy of willpower as a muscle. And I actually believe that myself. And even I was taught it in school, although they did at that point already say like, this is a bit contentious and some things don't make a lot of sense, but it's still the dominant theory.
Yeah.
And as I did more research, I basically found that it really doesn't make sense. Like, there are a lot of things about how our willpower works, and when it doesn't fail, that clearly show it's not a limited resource. For one, willpower does not deplete when you're doing something you love. If you're passionate about something, you can get into a state of what psychologists and presumably some drug addicts and hippies also call flow. And this is a state where you're basically very focused on something you like to do, and there are no signs of fatigue. You can, as long as you're really passionate and motivated for something, you can do something for hours. And in general, the more motivated you are for something, the less willpower depletion there is. So I often talk about willpower failure as a switch in attentional resources, a switch in your attention from have to tasks to want to tasks. So your brain is essentially bored. Willpower failure in large part is a lot like boredom. And it's not like a vat that drains, this limited resource theory, because there are a lot of situations where there's no sign of willpower failure. And there's also a lot of research that pointed into, or rather a lack of research, despite lots of attempts to look at what would be the limited resource, like what is it in our brain that is depleting? And researchers have found no such thing. The closest they found is blood sugar, where they thought, and indeed they could see in some research that if you're giving people sugar, then it enhances self-control. But later research showed that A, if people did not believe that willpower is limited, then it no longer worked. They didn't need the sugar anymore. And B, if you give them artificially sweetened water, or if you have them only rinse their mouth with the sugar and not actually swallow it, they just spit it out, it also works. Which goes to show that it really is simply, it's either a placebo effect in some research, in other research, it's simply the pleasure, the sensation of pleasure. And our willpower and pleasure and well-being are very intricately linked. Because essentially what willpower failure is, and this is in large part what goes on in the anterior cingulate cortex, if you're focused on something that's not providing instant gratification, then essentially there's sort of a clock that starts to tick in your brain, and your brain is saying, okay, we are not deriving any pleasure from this. So over time, you're becoming unhappier and unhappier. And as the brain is doing something that's, and realizing that something is making you unhappier, it tries to shift your attention to other things. And you can literally see this if you put scanners on someone's brain and you look at which regions of the brain are more active, or what kind of signs people are more sensitive to, then you can see that if people are in a state of willpower depletion, or if they're really focused on something like doing their taxes for 2 hours, then you can see that they are more sensitive in the reward pathways in the brain light up more when you show them something like Facebook icons or dollar signs or sex. So you can literally see that it's like the brain is telling you, these things that we're doing right now, we don't like it very much. Look at these other things. That's cool.
Yeah, so the brain is essentially wants to move towards pleasure-seeking behavior.
Yes. In large part, that's also what the brain does. Like a lot of the things we do are, or we're structured in such a way as to seek pleasure and avoid pain.
Right. And it's very difficult, or it has its challenges to be able to delay gratification and pleasure in order to focus on something that may have a benefit later as humans, I guess.
Definitely.
What was I going to say? It was, I totally lost my train of thought.
Deferring pleasure is, or investments in general, giving up something now to get something for later. That is the whole essence of most self-control decisions. Right. And that's also what we need the rational part of our brain for, what it evolved for. Because system one, emotional thinking, when most animals, they can't make decisions based on foresight. So that really is what we have the prefrontal cortex for. But it's also strenuous. We don't want to always do that. You can see in animals that the more investment choices animals have to make, because animals also sometimes have to, you can see that in some monkeys, for example, if you have to collect food for winter, or if it's more difficult to gather food, you can see that they have better self-control compared to opportunistic feeders. Those typically have very little self-control. Or cows, for example, they just eat grass the whole day. And there's nothing better for them to do at any moment in time than just to eat grass.
Right.
So they have very poor self-control, almost none.
Right. And from an evolutionary perspective, basically the system 2 has developed in order to control system 1, and that's what kind of separates us from a lot of animals that are opportunistic in nature. Is that kind of how that worked?
Yes.
Cool. So to kind of go off of that, how do we use our knowledge of system 1 and system 2 in order to be more productive and exert better self-control in our daily life?
There are a lot of things that we can do based on this knowledge. A big part, I think one of the big ones that's for both, that I've seen the most impact on people that have read my book and people, my own clients, is probably taking breaks, because it helps both for productivity and for diet adherence. A lot of people wait too long while they're doing things they don't like until their self-control fails. And ideally, you want to preempt that, because and this is also where productivity and diet adherence intersect, because when your willpower is depleting, when you're doing things that you have to stay focused on, you're getting bored / fatigued, you're also increasing your risk of diet deviations. Because if people see food in such a state, it becomes very difficult to resist it. Because the brain is primed for instant gratification, and you see food and there's a strong impulse to say, eat the food. And that increases your reliance even further on self-control. So in large part, a big part of the book is that you want to take breaks while you're doing things that you don't like doing. Preempt that especially the fuck it effect, which is basically what occurs when willpower reserves drain to such an extent that you're like, okay, whatever. A lot of people have this at some point. If you have a long day at work, or if you're going to a restaurant and you're constantly fighting self-control battles, and especially if you've had some alcohol, at some point there's this point where a lot of people just go like, okay, screw it, I'm just having whatever. And if you get to that point, you can do a lot of damage. And bodybuilders have this very often post-show, when there's not a clear plan, and it's just, there's a lot of food you can eat now, there's no more deadline, and then it's just, okay, all the breaks are off, we're just gonna eat everything we want. But just a little bit of foresight and preventing those scenarios, you can make huge differences, both in terms of diet adherence and productivity.
Right. I think being able to be ahead of your willpower fatigue or your system 2 fatigue is really important for diet adherence for a lot of reasons. I think when you mention Someone who had a really stressful, strenuous day at work, and they get home, not having to, having prepared food and not having to rely on, making decisions. Decision fatigue is something you mentioned in the book. Having something in their fridge ready to go, being ahead of the curve, I think, is a really important thing for a lot of people. I don't know if you mentioned this in the book, but something that I've heard a lot is that, I think you did, that people who have the best willpower use it the least, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
Their life is set up in a way in which they don't have to exert their willpower. Some things that are mentioned in the book is like maybe not keeping food on your counter or in visible spaces, having prepared food around. And I think like having breaks preemptively is really important. And there's a few other things like, as far as breaks in between tasks, like cold showers and other things that I've been utilizing, naps as well, has been really cool. And I just wanted to touch on the duration at which you can do a task that maybe is requires self-control. I think you said 90 minutes is probably a good window in which before you may need a break. Is that what was listed in the book?
Yeah. There's a lot of research, especially by Anders Ericsson, who's basically sort of made it his life to become the expert on experts in terms of studying people that become really, really good at what they do, like violinists, and funny enough, also research on typesetters, Morse code operators.
Oh, wow.
And this is also the lines of research where the 10,000 hour rule comes from, which is not really a rule, but it's sort of a rough guideline.
Right.
And he sees in his research that about 90 minutes is the time that most people can really deliberately focus on something. And the key word here is deliberate, because most people spend a lot of time doing stuff, but they don't spend that much time getting stuff done. And there's a big difference there. Like if you look at survey data, for example, where I've quoted some in the book, you see that most office workers are only productive, even self-admittedly, for like 3 hours a day. Right. So most people are less than 50% of the time. And speaking as a former business consultant, I can say that is 100% accurate. Like a lot of people, probably they have one good focused work bout in them of about 90 minutes. So, 3 hours is about 2 90-minute stretches when they get to work. And then after lunchtime, they have one more bout. And after that, it's pretty much, you're still doing stuff, but you're not really being very productive anymore. And probably if you would just force yourself, and then especially if your employer gave you the opportunity to say, well, if you get this done, then you can go home. I think a lot of people could get it done in about 3 hours.
Yeah.
And that's also what Ericsson found in his research, that even expert performers, like violinists that become the best in the world at what they do. And for people that don't know, being a violinist, it may sound like not very impressive, but it's one of the most skillful things. And there's murderous competition. It's an extremely, extremely skill-based profession for professionals. So yeah, even those, you see that it's like 2 to 4 hours. Some do as little as 2 hours per day on average, really focused work. But when they're doing it, they're really in the zone, they're really focused.
Yeah. That's I think the more like maybe data-driven companies you see, like I lived in Silicon Valley before I lived here, and I think a lot of those companies are implementing more breaks and things like that. And
yes, definitely. Google with nap pods.
Right. That's really cool. I think one of the funniest statistics in that chapter was the fact that workers, one of the ways they spent their time was looking for other jobs. Right.
It's literally in the top 10 of what they've spent most of their time on.
Right. Yeah, it's really funny. Okay, so how another one that's been really interesting to me that I've been utilizing, especially the last couple of days, is caffeine. So I read the chapter on how to make workouts more or less effortful, and then also there's the Yerkes Dodson law, I believe. So can you explain that, and then maybe if there is any relation, how that maybe like we can utilize our caffeine in a more strategic fashion instead of just maybe habitual, as I know I was doing prior to reading this book.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, caffeine, they abuse it essentially, which is the reason that many drugs become illegal, even if they're not necessarily detrimental.
Right.
And I think in fact, the biggest argument for drugs not being illegal, like alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, is that you can abuse them a lot without major problems. It takes a long time before you really do a big amount of damage. Whereas with like heroin, most pills, most things that you can snort, you can do a lot of damage very quickly.
Right.
Even though, objectively speaking, if you were to be meticulous and rational with the dosing, they might not be inherently more damaging. Especially when it comes to like MDMA, LSD, they're really not that bad compared to like weed, for example.
Right.
Weed's also not terrible, by the way. But key point to get to your question: Yerkes-Dodson law is basically a law or a psychological phenomenon that says there's an optimum level of arousal for most tasks, and that means more caffeine is not necessarily better. So there's a certain amount of arousal that you want for any kind of task, and this is higher typically for simple tasks. So if you just have to, plug in a lot of numbers in a spreadsheet, for example, you're probably going to do that better when you have had some caffeine. Put some music on, put the caffeine on, or get some caffeine in you, and just start typing all the numbers. But if I give you 5 Red Bulls, and now I tell you, look, here's an extremely complicated math puzzle to solve, then your mind's spinning and you're all over the place. You're probably going to have a difficult time focusing on that. So that goes to show that there's an optimum level. And I think for most tasks, this optimum is not that high. And for complicated tasks in particular, it's not high. In fact, it's probably not being stimulated at all is optimal. It's only for simple tasks that being stimulated is generally a net positive. So even for chess, for example, there's research showing that if you're more stimulated, then even if it's a nootropic drug like modafinil or Ritalin, like methylphenidate, then which is supposed to make you smarter, people don't actually become better at chess. They get more sort of immersed into it, but they lose more matches based on time. So in like they become better at like in a focused narrow sense of the word, but they're not actually objectively better in terms of net performance because they lose sight of the bigger picture.
Right.
And that's, I think, what happens to a lot of people. Plus, if you add to that withdrawal and tolerance with caffeine are actually much more significant than most people realize. Those occur at dosages of basically above 100 milligram per day. There was a recent study showing little habituation, but the average dosage there was about 100 milligram per day. So that's probably a decent ballpark number. Other research shows that especially when you get to 300 plus, which is like 3 cups of coffee, then over time, sleep quality suffers and anxiety increases. And you typically find yourself getting into a negative spiral where, especially if sleep quality suffers more, you're more sleep deprived, therefore you consume more caffeine, therefore you're more sleep deprived, therefore you consume more caffeine. Cycle. And in the end, a lot of people have this, you get to a point where it feels like caffeine still benefits you, but it actually just makes you less worse. Because this is also a problem in a lot of studies. When they have people that drink caffeine, which is almost everyone on the planet, and they say, okay, before the study for about 48 hours, you can't consume any caffeine. And then they do the study and they have placebo versus caffeine. And they see, okay, who's going to do better? And then caffeine does better. But what this research doesn't show is whether caffeine actually improves it above baseline or whether it's so that you need the caffeine to perform normal, essentially.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people that use caffeine, they're actually going into withdrawal, especially if you have headaches, if you have difficulty concentrating, if your workouts are a lot less, if your workout quality is noticeably lower without caffeine, you're probably at least habituated to some extent.
Right.
So if you're in that state, caffeine isn't really helping anymore. It's just undoing withdrawal. It's just, you need the caffeine to feel normal. Right. And if you're more meticulous with your dosage, and typically I recommend 100 milligram per day, on average about max, then you can actually profit from caffeine every single day. Every time that you use it, it makes you net better, not just, less worse. And the dosage also doesn't interfere with sleep if you at least consume it early enough on the day. I find that I need at least 8 hours to metabolize a dosage like that, but I'm pretty sensitive. However, there's one study showing, or two even, that a double coffee or a double cappuccino or double espresso, I think it was, even at breakfast, still impairs sleep quality at night that day. And that's far beyond where most people think they still have an effect of it. It's, there's no subjective effect anymore, but objectively, if you measure with polysomnography someone's sleep quality, it still goes down.
Yeah, the half-life is pretty long for caffeine, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, and I think it has effects on the receptors that persist beyond the active life of the substance.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can't remember what podcast I was listening to, but someone said that every sleep researcher they talk to, none of them drink caffeine, or at least on a regular basis. Right. And they were like, if that doesn't tell you something, then,
and so sleep is so important.
Right, 100%. I've been strategically lowering my caffeine intake. I think one of the things that really helped me was when I read in the book that so some of the side effects may be just due to my tolerance wasn't super high. I think I was having a half cup twice a day of coffee. But I think some of the side effects, we are just expecting to be really tired. And I actually did strategically use rhodiola. I don't know if you've heard of that dietary supplement to kind of attenuate some of the effects. And I feel surprisingly good. Like today was the first day I had tea because I have to get some work done this morning. And as you mentioned in the book, like L-theanine is a little bit better if you have to focus a little bit more, if you are going to choose to use caffeine. And I just realized like how habitual caffeine consumption was for me. Like I was just consuming it to consume it. It was more of just a ritual that I did. And I also want to get the performance enhancing benefits when I do go to use it for training. So I think that's one of the reasons why I chose to lower it. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people hear that and be upset because caffeine is it's very ingrained in our culture.
But that in itself, right? That in itself tells you a lot. When you tell someone, this is a problem because it's addicting, and they're like, "Oh my God, I can't believe there's no way I can do without this." It's like that's kind of the point.
That's what an addiction is.
Yeah,
that's funny. Yeah. So, and before we get off that topic, so you mentioned in that chapter, nicotine also is a stimulant that can help you with tasks that don't require as much focus. I think if you're going to be strategic and, you say needed some level of arousal, you could definitely, have different days where you had maybe caffeine or a small amount of nicotine, which you mentioned in the book is fairly safe. Up to 15 milligrams, it doesn't develop dependency.
As long as it's gum. As long as it's gum.
Yes, right. Yes. Not like smoking or chew tobacco or something like that. I just had this question briefly. Would something like THC, since it is, I mean, for myself, it's not, it brings me, I'm not as aroused. Would that be something that you could potentially utilize in an instance where you needed to focus more? Or, I mean, maybe it's different inter-individual, but I don't know, just something that I was curious about.
I think in terms of focus, it's probably mostly going to be the nicotine from the tobacco that helps. I think pure THC, like weed or marijuana, like hash brownies, I don't think it's going to have, I think there are very few scenarios where it's a net positive, like a nootropic effect.
Right.
Because it also has a lot of detrimental effects on simply cognitive functioning.
Right.
But it can definitely lower anxiety and reduce or improve focus in the sense of reducing anxiety and reducing jitters and the like. But I think often you would be better off like with L-theanine or nicotine if you want a stimulant effect, but with still the focus.
Yeah, I think that's where I intuitively had used very small amounts, like microdose of THC. And it's because I think I have sometimes I have a higher level, baseline level of anxiety. And just that, I guess, brings me to a point where I can be relaxed enough to focus on a task. So I guess that maybe
is also a really good option there.
Oh, really? Yeah, I've read about that a little bit. It has kind of this disinhibition effect and whatnot. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I don't discuss it in the book, but I have an article, extensive article on my website about Phenibut. That's probably, if you're looking at like something that reduces anxiety, especially social anxiety, Phenibut's probably the best there is.
Yeah.
And best to buy it now because it's probably a matter of time before it's
Yeah,
going to be
I've
very
heard
difficult
that.
to obtain it.
Yeah, kratom is another one in that category. I don't know if it has the same effects, but as far as legality, probably long term may be difficult to get. Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm glad we touched on that. So I guess the next thing I wanted to talk about was postprandial somnolence. This is something that I deal with because I am bodybuilding. I eat a large volume of food, and I also have a business that I'm trying to run. And sometimes it's very difficult because I'm eating such large volumes of food. Say like I get home from the gym and I have half box of cereal or a box of cereal with skim milk, and I just want to go to sleep after. And like it's generally a time where I try to get some work done, and it's really difficult. Like I have to fight it. Sometimes but also I've considered using some of your breaks, and some of those breaks are arousing, and I also don't want to be aroused in that time because I'm trying to recover and put myself in a relaxed state. So what is postprandial somnolence, and is there any way to attenuate its effects, or we just kind of have to power through it?
Yeah. Don't have good news here. Postprandial somnolence is the phenomenon that after eating, so postprandial, after being in the digestive state, you become sleepy, somnolent. And traditional explanations for this have been blood running away from the brain to the digestive tract, which is one of those things. It's like sort of makes sense in a pop science kind of way, but if you really think about it, it would be really, really bad if the brain didn't get enough blood every time you ate. So that's complete nonsense. There's plenty of blood to fuel the brain, and if anything, the brain would always be prioritized. So what really happens is there's a shift in sympathetic tone. So your nervous system essentially goes into rest and digest mode, which is parasympathetic dominance. And if you're in fight or flight mode, that's called sympathetic dominance. So after you've eaten, your body, evolutionary speaking, is essentially like, okay, mission accomplished. Maybe find someone to procreate with, and then we are all set in this life. So you want to be aroused typically to either find a mate or to find food, evolutionary speaking. And when you've done either of those, you get sleepy and relaxed. So there's not much we can do about this, and the effect is, in most research, proportional to energy intake. Food volume itself doesn't matter that much. It can help in terms of increasing satiety, which also enhances the relaxing effect. Like if you're still hungry, you won't be relaxed. But if you just have a high energy intake, like I'm currently bulking on 4,000 calories a day. So I have the same thing. After meals, it's not a good time to be super productive. Yeah. And especially in the mornings, it's annoying because I prefer to do intermittent fasting, but I'm going to have difficulty getting all my calories in if I don't eat until like midday. Right.
Yeah, I've learned to love dieting for that reason. I didn't know until I read this book why I felt so much more productive when I was dieting. And I think a lot of it is just due to the fact of the caloric volume that I'm consuming. And I do like to kind of fast, so to speak. I'm not generally hungry in the morning. So if I can push back that meal, I would prefer to, but again, you run into that problem of food volume in a more limited window. I think I've just learned intuitively to love dieting, and because I felt more productive, but I realized that it's probably in part due to the fact that I'm just eating a large volume of food. I just get so much more work done. I'm so much more productive. I think being slightly in that state of like, I don't know what the proper term is, but like when you're not satiated, so you're not in like a rest and digest, you're not, you
kind of in between.
Yeah, I'm able to, I don't know if it's like the urge to eat or whatever, that sort of energy, I'm able to like act on things a little bit better. And I guess maybe, again, because my baseline level of energy is a little bit lower when I'm eating a larger volume. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things you can try, but they're not going to be super successful. So one thing that does tend to work somewhat anecdotally, but not in research, is higher fat, lower carb. Okay. And research finds that it's just the energy content. The fat to carb ratio does not have a significant effect, but it's mostly limited to relatively small meals. And I don't notice an effect either if it's a 500 calorie meal. But if it's all you can eat sushi and I eat 2000 calories, mostly coming from rice, then I'm really tired. And I don't get that if I have like barbecue ribs or something, I don't eat that much, but typically I don't think I get high protein, high fat meals don't give me the effect as much. So that might be something there. Some people also call it carb knockout, which the name probably comes from somewhere.
Right.
So that might help. And like smaller meals.
Is it related to blood glucose at all? Sorry. Right.
No, it's not. You would think so. And research has looked at this extensively. In fact, blood sugar is one of the most overrated things in nutrition, like at all. At least for non-diabetics. Of course, for diabetics, it's a big thing. But for most people, for one, you have to realize that there's like 4 grams of glucose, 4 grams of sugar in the blood. That's it, okay? And it's simply very tightly regulated. So if you're not diabetic, then it's going to be in the range, a really narrow range, around 4 grams. And that simply doesn't have big physiological effects. And they've even done a lot of research where they follow people around with continuous glucose monitoring. And a lot of people think they have problems with blood sugar. Like they're saying, okay, I'm going hypoglycemic now. I can feel it. I have low blood sugar. And then you check the reading and it's like, nope, you do not. Yeah. So a lot of these things are probably in big part nocebo. People think that they're going to get this crash after the meal. And there is postprandial somnolence, but it's not related to blood glucose levels.
Right. Yeah. That's a good kind of segue. I was going to ask, there's a chapter, my girlfriend, I read this chapter out loud to her and she got kind of upset, probably due to her bias towards this subject, but she was, I was reading the chapter on energy restriction and how it affects energy levels.
Oh, yes.
And as far as what you mentioned in the book, it doesn't really affect energy levels that much. Could you explain that or elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that chapter is, from what I've heard from most people, a serious red pill moment.
Right.
When it's like Neo finding out he's in the Matrix. And I have to say, for me as well, I've read a few studies like that, and I felt, okay, interesting. But when you read 8 studies showing the same thing, and then a meta-analysis confirming it, then it's like you can't ignore it, right?
Yeah, that's what I told her. I was like, there's literally 8 references here. I don't know how much you can debate this topic.
Yeah, and in completely different populations, completely different research groups.
Oh wow.
Military personnel compared to like average individuals just dieting. Oh, wow. The research very unanimously shows, at least there's no research on contest prep, so I'm saying that as a caveat, but dieting itself, like energy restriction, does not affect cognitive functioning. It's very clear finding in research. It does not impact your mood, it does not impact sleep quality, and it does not impact how smart you are or how your brain functions. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. In fact, some aspects of cognitive functioning, like how smart we are, very roughly put, improve, like memory functioning, which makes sense in the sense of, if you're starving, you better be active and be sharp, because all that matters right now is finding food.
That's what I was saying about feeling more energized. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So, and again, if you're really well fed, you become relaxed. So that's kind of how the body works. So, like I said, this has been found in military personnel, a lot of subject or research where they give people modified gels. One of the famous experiments by Lieberman on this, I think for 2 or 3 days, I think it's 2 days, they give people only gels to eat. And with those gels, what you can do is you can, it all tastes like a gel with some flavor. And you can either have it have calories or have the gels not have calories. But it's a gel with a certain taste. So you can't tell. And then you find that if you do a lot of psychological testing on people after those 2 days, nothing is different between the 2 groups, even though one group was essentially completely fasting and the other group was just eating at maintenance. Yeah. So that is, a shocking finding. And the big difference there, like the one commonality in all these studies, is that people don't know that they are in energy deficit. But we cannot do that to ourselves, or it's at least very difficult. So we know we're in energy deficit, and then we get issues, then we get problems because we feel restricted. And the feeling of restriction is what saps on our well-being, because people really like being autonomous and choice. And that unpleasantness, that feeling of restriction and the general not feeling well, that is what makes us fatigued. That's causing willpower depletion, and that in itself, that in turn, and hunger as well. These negative emotions, they affect everything else in turn. So but the big message here is that there's nothing physical that's hurting you. It's just a mental effect. So that, I think it's really liberating. It's empowering. Like a lot of people are like, they feel like weak or something because when they read that chapter, like, I do definitely feel these effects. And yeah, I'm not saying you don't feel the effects. I'm saying they're not physical in nature. Right. So you can use psychological trickery on yourself to get rid of these effects. And you can rest assured that when you're dieting, in fact, there's also a big chapter of the book, or a big section at least, I go into that dieting makes you a lot healthier. Like almost every biomarker you look at of someone's health improves when they're in energy deficit, even in lean individuals. And it's crazy. Like what I often bring up during my last contest prep, I got some tropical virus infection or something. They couldn't really diagnose it in Brazil. And I had to get to the hospital, and they performed a lot of tests, and they couldn't really figure out what was wrong. They also measured my heart rate. And this was after I had taken my pre-workout with caffeine, and my resting heart rate was 30.
Oh, wow.
So I had the resting heart rate of like an ultra high level endurance athlete.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And I mean, if you think about it, it's 1 beat per 2 seconds.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And I felt completely fine. All my measures, everything was excellent. Everything was like super, super excellent. So it wasn't a detrimental effect, completely the opposite, but I felt terrible. There was late stage contest prep. I was probably like 6% body fat at the time. So I wasn't feeling good. Yeah. But it's really reassuring to know that it's not like you're breaking down. It's a mental battle.
I think maybe it may be more related to body fat levels. Like when you start to actually get like really exotically lean, that's maybe where you get some of that decline in functioning.
Definitely. I think it's still mostly psychological effects, but they are at least inevitable at this point.
Yeah, right. No. I guess it's very, when you're very food focused, I think that's just that state in general is difficult.
What I often what I like to describe a contest prep is you have a lot of things that you like in life. Like there's always, in every human being, or almost everyone, there's food and there's sex, but then there's other stuff. There's social interaction and intellectual stuff, and maybe games and hobbies. And when you go into contest prep, if you're really getting close to starvation, like pro bodybuilding condition is objectively as close to starvation as you can get. You want to be at essential body fat levels these days. Right. So when you get to the level, you can really feel like, if I look back on how I am as a person and what I like to do, I can really tell, like even based on the movies I like, or at some point the complete lack of any interest in movies, it's like all of these interests in my life, they are trickling down into, it's like the basics. And at some point, sex is also gone. Like your libido is gone, and there's just food.
Food, right? The hierarchy, right? It's just like you can't meet these other functions. You want to meet the base level ones first, right? If it was water, then it would be, if it was below, it would be like, I need to get water or survive or shelter or whatever that may be, right? It's that makes a lot of sense. So maybe a way to attenuate some of these effects are give people a little bit more autonomy and a little bit more choice potentially. Obviously,
and realizing it, realizing these things in the first place is a big step in itself.
Absolutely. I think, like you said, it's empowering being able to know this and accept it and be like, okay, a lot of the reason why I maybe feel like this is just my, like I'm expecting to be, like I expect to be in
exactly. It's a nocebo effect.
Right. That in itself's been really empowering, just knowing that, even with the caffeine thing that I've been doing, I've been able to say like, oh, I don't actually, now that I know these things, I don't actually feel as tired when I, am energy restricted or maybe reduce my caffeine intake. It was a lot of just expecting to be tired or whatnot, the nocebo effect. Cool. Just a few more things and I'll get you out of here. So I had one question here. So there's a lot of, I know you are like one of your interests or maybe even areas of expertise is economics. And I've always noticed this. One of the coaches I had not that long ago, probably a couple of years ago, was very would talk about dieting, adherence, and training, and all these things. He would have a lot of analogies to economics. And I've noticed a couple other people who are more prominent in the industry as well. Lane Norton, for example, Mike Isertel, my coach, was Stand Efforting. A lot of these people have talked about these commonalities between economics and diet and training adherence. What are some like really common principles that from economics that can be maybe applied or have some overlap into dieting and training adherence and things like that?
Yeah, I like to think about food and calories as an economist, and you can largely think of calories as money in a lot of ways. And a big part of self-control, and also the intersection between willpower failure, productivity, and diet adherence, because willpower failure and being productive and adhering to your diet, of course, all go hand in hand. Like if your willpower fails, you have trouble adhering to your diet, and you won't be as productive because you can't stay focused. And all of these things, in essence, they are an investment decision. You have to do something now that's not very enjoyable, or you have to give something up to get better results later. And the classic demonstration of this is the marshmallow experiment, where they have kids, they give them one marshmallow, and they say, okay, either you don't eat the marshmallow and then you get 2 in 15 minutes, or you can have the one marshmallow now. And of course, objectively, it's better to wait a bit and then have 2, but that's difficult. You have to control yourself. And that is, in large part, the whole essence of dieting. And other than hunger, I mean, in large part, it's just a matter of making these choices, because you know what the good choice is, but it's difficult. Your hunger and your system 1, essentially, are telling you, eat it. But system 2, your rational part of your brain has to say, no, not smart, wait, don't eat this, because later we can eat something else that's much better. And with money, it's the same. You can either spend it now, or you can invest in it, and then you have more money later. So with your daily energy intake, you can also think of that as a budget. Like, you don't have to spend it all. You can save some, and then you get it to greater energy deficit. And you can choose what you spend it on. And you have to find foods, or in economics, it would be whatever goods that you have that you can spend it on, but you can only spend it once. And the money's there. And in this sense, also the calories count. So, and that's also what I like about it. The analogy with money is that a lot of people have this idea that dieting is like, there's sort of a base where you can say, I don't opt in, like I'm not doing it. But that's not true. Like, you have to eat something, right? And the calories count. And the only difference is whether you know or you don't know. So people that eat normally, they're just not aware of their energy intake, but they're still eating something. And you can do the same with money. You can just not pay attention to your income and just spend and whatever. But, if you then run into problems, then you have serious problems.
Right.
I think there are a lot of analogies.
Yeah, having having a budget and being aware of your income and expense versus your intake and expenditure or something like that. I think also another one is you mentioned is performing like a cost benefit analysis, especially when you go down to sit and have a meal, right? Is this food per 100 grams worth the calories, right? That it has.
Yes, energy density is a really important one to always think about.
Yeah, and then another one that I like to talk about with my clients is just the cost benefit of maybe like, say someone wants to go out and have a couple of meals. Say one meal is with a place that you don't enjoy as much, and then later in the week you're going to maybe go to a restaurant that you really enjoy. Assessing whether it's worth it during that. Earlier in the week to go and have a burger and fries instead of maybe having chicken breast, and knowing later in the week you can have, a nice steak and dessert or whatever. And I try to have people think about that and be aware of those decisions. I think it's really important. And one of those areas of economics, I guess, that overlap, but
definitely. And it's important to make those decisions beforehand, as you say, like you want to plan it, because you can rationally make decisions when you're fed. But research shows what's called projection bias.
Projection bias, yeah.
That when we have a certain emotion, then we don't make decisions as rationally. And especially if we're hungry, of course, everyone knows it's much more difficult to make rational decisions. And importantly, we consistently underestimate the effect that emotions are going to have on our future self. So we are very prone to think, okay, you know, I can do this, or I'm going to be at this holiday with my friends in this cottage in the mountains. Now I'm just going to eat tuna and whey protein. And then it's like, well, when they're all eating food that's enjoyable and you're not going to be full from just eating tuna, it's going to be a lot harder. So you really have to anticipate and think of worst case scenario, essentially, and make sure that you're satiated. If you're going somewhere that you don't really enjoy in terms of restaurants, I think that's something a lot of people struggle with. Make sure you're satiated beforehand. And ideally also even look at the menu and just make the choice already. Like you don't have to wait until you're hungry and you're there and you have to eat something before you make that choice. You can look before and then say, okay, these are the best choices. And then that also frees up your mind. You can just focus on the company and everything.
Right.
You know, this is what you're going to eat. You don't have to think about it. And that's also like more big picture. Not having to think about food is so important for diet adherence, because if you don't have a meal plan, you don't plan things, then it's like every day anew. You have to create a new meal plan and you have to think about what you're going to eat. And the worst thing to do when you're hungry is to think about what you have to eat, because that's the worst possible timing to make these choices.
Yeah. And this decision fatigue is a big part of that too, right? Not having to decide in the moment what you're going to eat, because again, with the projection bias, you underestimate how hungry you might be. So you're attenuating that by making sure you're full and satiated, and you've already made the decision of what you're going to eat. So again, not having to rely on maybe as much of your system too, in an instance where you're setting yourself up for success.
Exactly. As you said, like the most successful people actually are the people that use their will control the least.
Yeah.
And even there was a pretty recent study on students that found, interestingly, that actual objective self-control ability was not related to academic success at all. Like the relation was entirely mediated by their ability not to use their self-control. And that's like, even if you have good self-control, like to circle back all the way to the first thing you said, it's much better if you don't have to use it, because you'll feel better. And, even if you are sort of a robot, most people are not, you can just have a much easier, happier life. And I think there's been a big surge these past years in bodybuilding where competitors are taking a more balanced approach and making it a part of their lifestyle that's more sustainable, and they're more mindful of what they're doing, as opposed to the more traditional tendency of hardcore restriction and then extreme binges, and only sort of balancing out in the sense of, with the extreme dedication later on, you get to the same point again, but it's not a fun way to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, for myself, why I've chose to go down a more data-driven path with my bodybuilding approach. I think I've had some coaches in the past that have preached that more unsustainable practice, and I knew that I loved bodybuilding, like deep down, but I wasn't able to enjoy it as much when I was doing these overly restrictive diets or unsustainable training programs. And I think that's just a really big thing, and why it's important that we understand these things so we can take more enjoyment out of our daily life, out of bodybuilding or fitness pursuit or whatever that is. And especially for someone who, is just wants to lose weight to be healthy. It's like there's no point in having them suffer through any of it. It should be a part of their lifestyle. It should be sustainable. It shouldn't take away from their family or personal relationships either.
Definitely. I think a big, really nice thing about the etymology of the word diet is that it actually comes from Greek, and dieta, it meant way of life.
Yeah.
Not like this short, unsustainable period of suffering to get short-term results for your wedding or on the beach.
Right. Yeah. And I think that it's important to look at it that way and build these habits and whatnot that make it a way of your life, and not having to feel like you're, I guess, yo-yo dieting is what a lot of people end up succumbing to. So, yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to close out this podcast. Menno, I know you have a PT course. Could you just, I know if you go to the website, it'll probably explain it. Could you just briefly explain kind of what that PT course does? I'm thinking about doing it myself shortly, but I wanted to maybe give a little bit of a background.
Yeah, it's an online certification course that takes you from A to Z, even if you have no background knowledge, but it's definitely going to be easier if you are familiar with bodybuilding and the like. So you know the basics, and it takes you in a very data-driven, evidence-based approach. Basically teaches you everything you want to know or need to know about fat loss, muscle growth, strength development, but also going in a lot of detail on diet adherence. And for the professionals, about 50% of people that do it are professionals. There's also a business chapter, so it's very comprehensive. It's just basically it's what I and a lot of researchers have looked at as the best answer to everything you want to know about these things, based on the last 10 years of our lives researching and putting the best answer to everything. So it's really comprehensive. So I learn new stuff sometimes when I read it, a new chapter. Yeah, I think it's like my magnum opus. Like all of my knowledge is in the course.
That's really cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I definitely will be checking that out. I can't recommend this book enough to people. I'm going to continue to recommend it to people because I just think it's, for myself, again, has had a very large impact on my daily life. I'll probably reread it again here soon because I'm sure I missed some things and I want to implement as much and be able to, use it with my clients as much as possible, be able to help them better. I think it's huge in that aspect as well. Super digestible, really great book. You have a lot of good articles on your website as well. So definitely, I'll link all those down below. Check those out. Is there anything else you wanted to mention, Menno?
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
I really, want to say this here, but I really do look up to you in a lot of ways. And, I aspire to be at that level, at least at some point in my career. So thank you for all that you do and all that you produce. It really helps me. Every little thing you post on Instagram, I read through all of it. It's super helpful to me. So thank you.
Nice, man. That's really great to hear.
Yeah. All right, man, I'll let you get out of here. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. See you.
Have a great day. Bye.